Welcome everyone to Video Chess Training. On YouTube, my name is International Master William Paschall. This is my YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. Today we're going to take a look at a game from the recent Norway Chess Tournament 2016 from round 1. Very strong grandmasters doing battle here. Anish Giri, who recently competed in the World Championship Candidates Tournament with all draws. Very solid result from the Netherlands, playing white. And Grandmaster Pavel Eljanov, rated over 2760, playing black from the Ukraine. Let's take a deep look at this game. Giri playing white plays e4, e5 now. And I think that e5, the most common move in the history of chess, but more and more popular now, I think, as computer engines and accurate play make it more and more difficult to play sharp openings like the Sicilian. Knight to f3, knight to c6, and now bishop to c4. Avoiding the Spanish with bishop to b5. Another opening where theoretically white has trouble getting an advantage after bishop b5, knight f6 in the Berlin defense. And also other lines are problematic as well, including the Marshall Gambit. So bishop c4, now bishop to c5 from Eljanov. This move probably more popular than knight to f6, the two knights defense, though I don't think there's anything wrong with the two knights defense. This move seems to be much more common. What can white do here other than go into a Giuoco piano, Giuoco pianissimo? The Evans Gambit is an interesting option which hasn't been played a lot in recent times. Bishop c5, castles, and then knight to f6. And now the theory with c3 and the Giuoco piano pretty much played out. So we see a Giuoco pianissimo, d3 and d6. This is black's most flexible move. And now c3, entering the starting position for the Giuoco pianissimo, or quiet game. And black here castled, but I think if I have to vote for a move, I would prefer the more flexible approach with playing a6. Not committing necessarily to an early kingside castle. It doesn't seem necessary. Also interesting is bishop to b6, a different way of sort of preempting white expanding on the queen side. So those moves I prefer a little bit. Castles is fine though, a bit committal. Now white has a whole host of possible moves. Bishop b3, which is the most common. Knight on b to d2. We did see knight a3, this concept of knight to a3 development in the Giuoco pianissimo in the candidates tournament in Russia recently, but I think that's more of a kind of a new idea, not necessarily going to supersede the more standard lines. And other moves that are possible are h3, little bit passive, b4, this queenside expansion line, very common. And also bishop g5, this is a common theme that happens when black commits to castling kingside early. And it's going to pop up in this game in our analysis. So rook e1. Now after castles, rook e1, not really a common line. Very rare actually. There's nothing wrong with the move, most likely, but it's not played very often. The other moves are favored. What can we say about it? I mean, maybe white wants to play knight on b1 to d2 to f1 quickly. He wants to discourage d5, but I found some interesting ideas here. The moves that are most common for black are a6. Again, recommended way of preparing to retreat the bishop on c5. Bishop b6. h6, stopping bishop g5 may be a worthwhile investment for black. This move is played fairly frequently in these lines to stop bishop g5. And then finally, a move that you can't play, knight a5, because after b4, knight takes c4, b takes c5, and the knight has to go to a very awkward square. Knight, b takes c5, knight a5, when I would think white has a slight advantage here. So knight to a5, not necessarily really a reliable move, but an interesting concept. And if we look at the next line, which I explored, it works a little bit better. So after rook e1, theoretically, this may be a new idea. Black could play knight to g4 in this position against Giri. And This happens sometimes with reverse sides. Sometimes white even plays knight g5 with the black rook on e8, and black has to play like rook e7 to balance the defense against f7. But it's particularly interesting in this position to try the move knight to g4, because at first glance it looks like, oh, it's no big deal. You take pressure off the center, white can play d4, and he has a good game. But it doesn't work, because after d4, black has a very, very strong tactical resource. E takes d4, and then c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight takes d4, queen h4, which is a crushing attack for black in this position, attacking f2, attacking h2, and basically winning for black. So knight g4 is a very, very strong and interesting idea in this position. Now white isn't lost. White has to play rook e2, and after rook e2, we have an interesting position where I guess knight a5 is the problem for white, and things are very interesting. It's more or less forced. Rook e2, and then if you try the trick b4 here, then things aren't so clear. We take on f2, rook takes f2, bishop takes f2, king takes f2, and then we smash the structure, get the bishop, the valuable bishop, knight takes c4, d takes c4, and we get counterplay with this classic pawn break f5. And I think that this is fully playable for black, and even I probably would rather be black if I had to choose a side here, although I would evaluate the position as relatively kind of like a dynamic equilibrium. I won't call it equal because it's not really equal, but I think both sides have equal chances. So maybe then we would continue with something like queen d5 check, king h8, king to g1, c6, and queen d3. When it's difficult to kind of evaluate, but I think that I feel black has the more dynamic possibilities, although white should be able to hold the position. So I don't know, this would be a totally new idea. Although I think that Giri's move rook e1 is not very often played. Now, having said all this stuff, here black played a5, which is a move that I don't like. I respectfully disagree with Grandmaster Eljanov about a5. This move to me seems like rather weakening, and you can see obviously that the b5 square in particular is vulnerable to attack. So there's no need to play a5. a6 we looked at already, knight to g4. So he plays a5. I think a5 is dubious. And now Giri goes with bishop g5. And this is a real problem, because I think if we had played a6, maybe black could try something like queen e7 with the classic ideas of knight d8 and knight e6 to try to break the pin. But in any case, a5 just felt like unnecessary weakening move. Still, maybe we still would do the same thing Eljanov did here with h6 and g5. Just it would be better to have not weakened the b5 square on the queen side. I don't really have a problem with h6 and g5. It's probably forced here. h6, g5, bishop g3, and now we've got a5 and g5. A lot of pawn weaknesses for black. And again, I prefer to not weaken so many squares. Objectively, black's position might be okay, but for a human being to have to defend all those weaknesses, it's not so easy as it is perhaps for like a computer program that says, well, black is equal here. Proving it over the board isn't so simple for a human mind. So I think I would prefer not to have so many pawn weaknesses. At this point, Eljanov played bishop a7, which is really a very prudent move. I think correct. But instead he could have played g4. Not an unusual kind of idea. In the Women's World Championship, there was a game played in the same structure where black played g4, white had to play knight h4, and the knight never really got off the side of the board. That's a positional idea that can happen, that can be long-term and disadvantageous for white. But here, Giri no doubt would have seen d4. There's a very strong rejoinder, getting in d4 with a lot of counterplay. based on attacking e5, or else getting white to forfeit control of this, getting black to forfeit control of the center. So the very important resource here to know about d4. So Eljanov played bishop a7, and now knight a3. At first glance, you think, wow, Giri's just copying Caruana from the World Championship Candidates Tournament. No, this is not a question of fashion here. This is a question of logic. If there's ever been a position in the the Giuoco Pianissimo where knight a3 made sense, this is it. Because, in particular, the b5 square is very weak. The knight can hop into b5 at some point, attacking the bishop on a7. So knight a3, very logical. It has that Caruana plan of knight c2, knight e3, but also the possibility to jump into b5. Now, at this point, I thought black could play solidly with bishop e6, challenging the bishop on c4, when white is a little bit better. But again, I think a move worthy of consideration. He played instead very actively with bishop g4, and now h3, bishop to h5. Black has no intention of giving up that piece, which is actually a pretty important defender. Here it's defending g6, defending f7. It's going to tuck itself back on g6 and to help protect the king, because black doesn't have a lot of guardians of the king side here. Now knight to c2, knight chooses its path, and at this point I think white is slightly better. Black here, difficult to find a plan, but I like the following move, the bishop to g6. I couldn't really think of what else to do for black here instead of bishop g6. Maybe like a strong point type of plan with knight d7, but it looks weird to leave the d5 square completely open. So I think that white's better there. Bishop g6 keeps pressure on the center, keeps pressure on the e4 pawn, guards the black king side, and makes way for the plan of knight h5. Now Giri here doesn't have to play bishop h2. It's a square where I have to say, often with white in the King's Indian, it can be a bad position. In Benoni, it can be a bad position for a bishop where it kind of gets stuck out of the game. And here the same thing can happen. This bishop can become a kind of problematic piece. But Giri is willing to live with it. Bishop h2, and then knight h5. And this is an interesting situation, and I'm not sure what white should do here. He played d4, which is fine and quite okay, challenging black's center. Now the black knight moved away from the center. It seems kind of logical to strike in the center with d4. But alternatively, the positional approach with knight e3 looks logical to me. I think that Giri just didn't really like the idea of the black knight sitting on f4, but objectively that one piece probably can't do too much damage, and I think white has superior game after a4. We could even maybe take the knight with that bishop that's kind of questionable, and have very good play on the white squares with white. I don't think white's ever going to be worse here. So I would say slightly better for white in the event of knight e3. But instead we play d4, and black goes back with knight f6. So it's kind of like provoking white to overextend his center with knight f6 here. But white isn't overextended. I think white is a little bit better, and it's getting complicated now which way we should handle the tension in the center here, particularly for black. After this move, knight f6, d takes e5. I guess the best try for white. D takes e5, and now critical position where there are a bunch of options. But interesting would be knight takes e5. And now knight takes e5, d takes e5, queen f3. Classic move in the Giuoco, putting queen on f3. There's a weak square on f5. The black king side is somewhat weakened. We avoid exchanging queens, and we have the plan of knight e3, knight f5. So that variation to me looks very promising. Say queen e7, knight e3, knight e3 with a clear plan to put a knight on f5. This maybe black gives up the bishop in this position with bishop takes e3. We obviously have knight f5 threatened. Bishop takes e4, knight f5 is very dangerous. So white has a strong attack. That variation looks promising. So let's look at instead d takes e5. And now this would have given Giri like a couple of possibilities to take on e5. Maybe this is black's best. D takes e5. If we take with the knight on e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, and now knight takes e4. And I thought this is maybe black's best try to simplify the position to some degree. White can try to keep queens on the board now with knight to d4. And things look a little dangerous for black because the white pieces are very strong. Queen e7, and I thought f4 here, trying to open up the king side. It looks dangerous, but I don't see any winning move for white. So I would say unclear, to slight advantage to white. Somewhat dangerous position. I could understand if Eljanov was a little concerned if he saw this position. f4 looks sort of double-edged. So no easy answer for this this game for black here. All lines look a little scary. He in fact took with the knight. Knight takes e4. And now knight e3. He's threatening f2. Knight takes e4, very natural. Knight e3. And here black could do this a couple different ways. He played knight takes e5. Instead, it's possible to play d takes e5, and then knight to g4 is possible. But I don't think it's really dangerous because black can play queen e7 here. Queen e7, avoiding the trade of queens and guarding the e5 point, keeping f6 guarded. The h6 pawn, not really a big deal here. We've got pressure on f2. So I think black's holding it together there. Instead of this, after knight takes e5, we can play knight takes e5, d takes e5, bishop d5 instead of knight to g4. And I thought this is also equal. Queen d6, bishop takes c6, queen takes c6, knight takes e5, simplifying, queen e6. And it looks like it balances out, and despite the slightly weakened king side for black, he's probably okay with the active minor pieces. White could play like queen d7 here, for example, and then we trade queens, and it looks like pretty equal. Rook on f to d8, and black is okay. So in the actual game, knight e3 was played, and black played knight takes e5. And there's the interesting chance here for Giri. We're kind of trained as chess players to value bishops slightly more than knights, so it's always kind of automatic to take first with the knight, to go forward first with the knight. But I think that bishop takes e5 was a very interesting try here. Bishop takes e5. A tactical idea is d takes e5, and again, avoiding the trade of queens with this move. Very hard to find for a human being. Queen c2. Everything based on this guy on g6. The knight moves, we have queen takes g6, check. The f7 pawn is pinned. So black has really nothing better than king g7. And then bishop d3, undermining the knight on e4, chasing it away. When white has a pretty big advantage, I think a clear advantage after knight to d6 and bishop takes g6. So structurally, black is in very, very bad shape here, fighting for a draw. But his king's somewhat open. I think it's clearly an advantage to white, slight advantage to white, pushing clear advantage, but maybe not a clear advantage. It's very close. Less than a pawn, but a significant advantage for white. Bishop takes g6. So that would have been an interesting alternative to take with the bishop on e5. Instead, he took with the knight on e5. And now, at this point, we have d takes e5, and this is what perhaps Eljanov missed. The white has a strong resource here, knight to g4. Defending f2 and attacking e5 and f6 and h6. And Eljanov just missed the point. It looks like, I assume he missed the point here. I don't think he voluntarily went into this. I mean, it looks like an unpleasant ending that he goes into. So it feels like he missed something here. Technically, he doesn't really lose material the way the game goes, but it looks like an extremely unpleasant position to voluntarily go into. And apparently black could have held the game by playing king g7. King g7 here, or also possibly even king h7, when it's not clear that white is necessarily winning this position. But I think king g7, I'm not sure I trust king h7. It looks like king g7. Scary to allow like a capture on e5 with check, but when it comes down to it, it doesn't look like white necessarily has anything after f6. So black just had to pull the trigger on king g7, and it looks like he's probably holding on. But instead he played h5, another pawn weakness. First we had a5, and then g5, and now h5. How many pawn weaknesses can black afford? Not this one, because this time the advantage tips to white after this surprising move. Rook takes e4. Maybe overlooked by black. Rook takes e4, and then the exchanging queens doesn't do anything. It would only improve white's position. So bishop takes e4, and now white must exchange queens to get control of the f6 square. Queen takes d8. Rook on f takes d8. I'm not sure which rook is better here. I mean, it seems to me like maybe the a rook is worth considering, because the f rook helps protect around the black king. But in any case, he took with the f rook. It's probably okay. Knight f6 check, king g7, and knight takes e4. Smoke clears, and materially, white is not winning necessarily. White has a bishop and knight in exchange for a rook and pawn. But as is often the case in chess, there are many variables that come into play here. And the one that seems the most important is the quality of black's pawn that he has in exchange for this rook for two minor pieces situation. So immediately there's a hanging pawn at e5, there's a hanging pawn at g5. Black has nothing better than f6, and immediately Giri plays g4. And what happens here is that black effectively isn't really up a pawn anymore, if you think about it. Strategically, this majority of 4 pawns on the king side is completely immobilized in a particular structure at hand. So effectively what's happening is that Giri is just kind of up 2 pieces for a rook on the other side of the board, and I think that gives him a clear advantage. Black cannot mobilize effectively his extra pawn on the king side, therefore its value is very little. He plays the best move, h4, trying to get a little space and kind of deny this bishop on h2. Giri himself grabs some space with a4, and now a computer is going to defend this kind of passive position very well, I think, because computers have no emotions. They can't be angry because they made a mistake. They look at every position the same way. They're sort of like objective in a way, but if we can say that. But a human being may be angry, may be disappointed with themselves about the previous play. So here, Eljanov now makes a move which is very committal. He plays c6. But I don't think it's necessary, and it's another pawn weakness black maybe can't afford. So it looks as though black has to sit tight and play rook d7 here. Rook to d7, preparing to double rooks, make the most of his pieces. After rook d7, king f1, rook d8, kind of keeping white a little bit busy on the d file, king e2. There's no question that white has a clear advantage here. But it might be hard for white to actually win the game, and if there's any chance at all for black to survive this ending, it's probably with this plan of doubling rooks on the d file and not creating any more pawn weaknesses. So he plays c6. That later will create more weaknesses in the position. King f1, and then again I think he should double rooks on the d file in an attempt to kind of just limit white's options, if nothing else. You know, prevent white from maneuvers like using the knight to d2, bishop to d3, because these maneuvers allow him to improve his position. But instead, Eljanov just basically starts moving his king back and forth, which is very strange. King g6, king e2, and then he makes a move, rook on a to b8. But bishop e6, and there's no more b5 with tempo. So now king to g7 and f3. And you see the plan now, bishop g1. White will be able to trade off that bad bishop, which had trouble getting in the game. It's always a tricky piece on h2, like in a London system or King's Indian. But f3, he's going to trade that off, and he's going to play an ending where he has two pieces effectively. This extra pawn for black immobilized on the king side. And two pieces for a rook is usually a decisive advantage. Rook e8 and abandoning the d file. Bishop c4, rook back to d8. Of course now, Giri not going to cooperate. He's going to reposition his pieces. If black had doubled on the d file, it wouldn't be so easy for white to win this game. Now bishop d3, and you see what he does. Black plays king f7, and even there, instead of king f7, I still think we should play rook to d7. Try to interfere with white's plans. King f7, knight d2, and king e7, still rook d7, is at least an active try for black. But he just ignores the idea of repositioning the pieces. King e7, knight c4, and suddenly black's position is almost terminal. a5 is hanging. b6 would weaken the structure more. White would just start more threats with bishop e4, knight e3 perhaps. Black plays rook to d5, and then bishop e4. And I guess just simply tired of defending, tired of resisting in this unpleasant position. His best chance would have been rook d7, just giving up the a5 pawn. Rook d7, knight takes a5. Probably a winning position for white, but still some work to do if we play it that way. But Eljanov instead played rook c5, boxing his own rook on c5, perhaps in time pressure, I'm not sure. But knight to d2, now the rook is trapped on c5. A very bad coordination with the rook on c5, bishop on a7. b5, bishop g1. Black will lose at least the exchange here, so he resigned. Down material already and facing at least an exchange loss additionally. So very, very strange game. I thought an interesting game by Giri, though, an instructive game. You know, not a perfect game by either side, but instructive, how it developed, and the various ideas that were really taking place there. So I thought this was one of the more complicated struggles from the first round of Norway 2016. Anish Giri against Pavel Eljanov. Also, Giri's first serious tournament game since the Candidates Tournament, getting a win in round 1 after his last tournament where he drew every single game. I thought this was a kind of significant statement for Anish Giri, answering his critics as to his accumulation of draws in the last tournament with a decisive victory in the first round of the very strong Norway 2016. I'm International Master William Paschall. Thanks for joining me here at Video Chess Training on YouTube. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video. Thanks a lot, and bye-bye.